Well, hello everybody. Happy Friday. Hope you've had a good week and are ready to start a new story today. Last Friday we finished Robin Hood, and today we're going to start a new story. So we'll look forward to that in a minute. But first, our shout out. And this week's shout out goes to PeeDee Sanddigger. Hope you'll check him out. He has a metal detecting channel and just a fun guy to watch. And a good sense of humor and sense of adventure. And I think you'll enjoy checking him out. So check out PeeDee Sanddigger. All right, it's story time. And this week we're going to start a new story. It's actually, in a sense, a biography. Don't go, oh, boring, because it's actually not. It's quite good. It's titled Land Rovers. And it's the story of Robin Baker as told to Roger Bateman. And it's a story of a young English fellow who goes to Australia to help with map making. And it's actually a very enjoyable story. So give it a chance. All right? So this is Land Rovers Chapter 1, titled Tenderfoot. Hey there, sport! Let us in! Dave thumped on the cracked paint of the old hotel door with his fist, while I climbed out of the Land Rover. Dave thumped again, so hard the whole wooden framework of the two-story hotel rattled and shook. Down the road, on the main street, a man put his head out the window of a general store. "You'll have to make a bigger noise than that, chum," he yelled. "Old Ma Prout's hearing ain't so good." Dave looked around at me, grinning. "Give the old girl a toot on the horn, Robin." Then as I leaned my elbow on the button beside the steering wheel, he cupped both hands to his mouth and bellowed, "Mrs. Prout!" and simultaneously kicked the base of the door with his heavy boot. Mrs. Prout would have had to have been as deaf as a post to ignore the sum total of the din we made. "I reckon they could have heard that lot right over in Woomera," muttered Dave. Then he chuckled, "Loud as an atom bomb. They'll think they've got rivals." The door opened slowly and grudgingly, and a hard-faced woman of about 50 peered out at us. "Can you put us up for the night, missus?" Only after he said it did Dave seem to realize he'd spoken in a normal voice. He put both hands on his hips, drew in an enormous breath, and repeated the question in a shout. Ma Prout examined Dave with small beady eyes that seemed to be searching his past and assessing his character at the same time. Then she looked past him and stared at me with the kind of cold suspicion that made my flesh creep. Her eyes took in the Land Rover, the huge bundles on the back, and the rifle barrels sticking out at the top. "Is you kangaroo hunters?" she asked. "I ain't got no rooms for thems that shoot roos." It was then, while Dave explained that who we were, and I looked down the 200 yards of wooden houses to the open country beyond, that I began to wonder what in the world I was doing here, facing the prospect of another night in a hard bed, 12,000 miles from home. Every bone in my body ached. The bone-shaking journey in the overloaded Land Rover on the long straight road had been more than I'd bargained for. But, I told myself, I had been warned. I couldn't say I hadn't been given ample warning. "Wake up, Robin! We want to get the car stowed away before it's dark." I hurried to give Dave a hand. For a moment I'd forgotten that here in the Australian outback, both dawn and dusk took only moments. Night fell like a theater curtain, often catching you in the middle of some complicated job which could not be continued until you had scrambled around in the blackness hunting for a lantern. Luckily, the job of stowing away meant nothing more than getting out the things we needed for the night, seeing that all of our precious equipment was secure against any midnight marauders, and then parking the Land Rover in the yard behind the hotel. Theodolites and boxes of aerial photographs might not be much use to a thief, but tin food, clothes, and petrol would interest any lonely wanderer. Afterwards, I staggered indoors, still saddle-sore from the hours of bucketing over the rough road. But there was a strong smell of steak. and it revived me. I was not yet fed up with steak. That would come later. At this moment, steak was the rich, succulent cure for the toughest day's driving I had ever known. Turn and turn about with Dave along the road north from Adelaide in the direction of that mystery town that stands alone in the middle of the great Australian nowhere, Alice Springs. Until now, Alice Springs had been no more than the name in a school atlas at home in England. After supper, as I lay in my bed and listened to the distant, rowdy singing from the pub down the road, I wondered what I'd have said a year ago if somebody had forecast that today I would be on a road to what the Aussies call the Ellis. The decision had been mine alone. Luckily, my family is the kind that tests you and then trusts you. When I had announced that for me education did not stop on the final day of that last term of school, that I wanted to go across the world on my own, I had help instead of opposition. I had sailed from England on a dull September day and had my 18th birthday on board ship during the voyage. Now, hundreds of miles up country with Dave, I thanked my stars I had remembered to take my driving test before setting sail for Australia. Without that, I could have taken no part in the making of the map or giants. "Come on, Robin, out of it! Time for breakfast!" I looked up at the grinning face of Dave, then closed my eyes again because the sunlight pouring into the bedroom was too bright for comfort. Morning had come too quickly. But though I could still feel the soreness from yesterday's hard traveling, excitement carried me out of bed and over to the washbowl without any second call from Dave. It was early summer. As we left Ma Prout's hotel and drove out of the small town, the countryside looked more like England than my idea of Australia. After 2 weeks of almost continuous rain, though the roads had quickly become as dusty as usual, the creeks and rivers were running high, and the trees were a vivid green. Fat sheep grazed along the road, making the most of the luxuriant growth of grass. How we took the wrong road, I have no idea. It was early in the day when we made the mistake, and an hour or more before we realized it. We'd passed farmers on their way to work. When the road began to get narrower and the surface became rougher, we stopped, a trifle worried, and asked if there was a junction ahead that would take us back to the main road. "Just keep going," they assured us, and we did, right up to the brink of an enormous lake, at the other side of which we could see the road emerging again. Dave looked at me with a wry smile and lit his pipe. He dug his hand into his pocket and produced a penny. "Heads or tails?" he said. "Heads or tails for what, Dave?" "Well, we don't want to drive into this until we know how deep it is, do we? One of us has got to wade through first." He spun the coin and yelled, "Heads!" I never win at tosses. I climbed out of the Land Rover and reluctantly pulled off my trousers. "Go on, don't be shy. This is the bush, in the middle of nowhere. We're not in the middle of Melbourne. There's no one watching." Well, at least the water would be warm in this climate. I walked in boldly and was up to my thighs in it before I let out a yell that brought a hoot of laughter from Dave. The water was just above the freezing point, thawed snow from the mountains to the north. It was a slow, careful job maneuvering the Land Rover through the flood of the water coming within inches of the spark plugs. A Land Rover is no lightweight to push on a level road, but pushing it in more than 2 feet of water would have been impossible. Inch by inch we moved forward, sweating at the thought of the long walk back for help if we got stuck. But with a jubilant roar, the engine picked up speed, and with water sluicing off the wheels, we lurched back up onto dry land. Then, at a comfortable 40, we cruised into Port Augusta. "Take a good look," said Dave. "This is the last real town you'll see until we reach the Ellis. After this, it's just a long haul through 600 miles of nothing." We were looking out over the estuary as he spoke, taking in huge gulps of sea air. Small ships were unloading at the wharf. Behind us in the town center were stores at which we would load up with food for the journey. We also took on 35 gallons of petrol and 25 gallons of water. Ready? I nodded. Nothing else you need? It'll be a long time before we see shops again. I was uneasy for a moment as I went over a mental list of things like toothpaste, soap, the other sheer essentials you take for granted until you head out across the desert. I think I've got the lot. Dave let in the clutch. Gardens and trees raced past, and suddenly we were off the smooth main street of Port Augusta and on a rough road with nothing but rocks and scrubby bushes on either side. Dave must have seen the look on my face. Pretty grim, isn't it? That shrub, gidgee, they call it, is just about the only thing that grows here. What are those hills over there on the right? They're the Finder's Range. Next thing we come to is Woomera. The rocket range? I looked ahead, interested. Don't get worked up about it, Robin. You won't see much. Anything that's worth seeing is well tucked away. Look, there you are, just a few houses down that side turning, and those big domes like balloons. And the signs, of course. I noticed just one as he spoke. It said, Testing Area. Drive at your own risk. It looked like an ideal place for testing rockets. Nothing anybody might do could make it any worse than it already was. Stony and desolate, the desert stretched in all directions, mostly so barren that even the gidgee bushes could not survive. The road itself had become rapidly worse, and was no more than a track between boulders. They send a road grading machine up and down it about once in 3 years, Dave explained. But that's all. Costs too much for the amount of traffic that uses it. What about those lakes up ahead? Couldn't they irrigate the land? And couldn't they use it for sheep? Dave let out a snort of laughter. Trust me to get an Englishman for a mate. You Pompies, reckon I'm going to wear my jaw out explaining things on this trip. Have another look at the water in those lakes when we get a bit closer. Puzzled, I wiped the dust off the windscreen and peered ahead. It doesn't look like water at all. It isn't, Copper. It's salt. Maybe once in a while there's a foot of water after heavy rains, but the rest of the time you could carve it up in slabs and flog it to housewives. Ship the whole thing a bit closer to civilization, and I'd do it myself. There's more money in salt than map making. He paused. No, I'm only kidding. I wouldn't change my job. I looked at him, wondering what it was that drew a man of 30 back into this wilderness time and time again, when he could have had a comfortable living working for the survey section of the big city council. I was a bit shy of asking, but I did. Dave shielded his eyes from the setting sun, which was dead ahead of us at this point. You'll find out, he said shortly. Just don't think about it, and maybe you'll come to understand. It was an odd answer, but everything was odd about that evening. Except for the rumble of the Land Rover along the dirt road, there was not much sound. No birds or animals appeared. The few scraps of gidgee clinging to the surface of the desert seemed to cower flat as if afraid. Everything about Australia from the moment of arrival had been a little strange. That was natural. But now, in the 30-odd miles since we had passed Woomera, the surroundings had become unearthly. I felt as if we were two small, insignificant specks of life on an otherwise dead planet. It was land, millions of square miles of land, utterly useless to man except as a place for testing his means of destroying himself. Driving through it, all sense of time seemed to disappear. It could have been 10 million years before human life began, or a time in the future, with Woomera standing alone in the desert like the grim statue of Ozymandias. The hills we drove over were endless, gently rounded curves, so large that one could never see a view on reaching the top, because somehow the top did not exist. Perhaps once they had been mountains, and millions of years of erosion had worn them down until all that remained were vast hummocks in the wilderness. Looks like the whole place has died of old age, doesn't it? Said Dave. He yawned. Like to take over for a while? He halted the Land Rover and climbed out to stretch himself while I moved over to the driving seat. Where do I head for? I asked him. You haven't any choice, mate, unless you turn the car around and go back again. This road doesn't have any turnoff. It was getting dark now. Just switch on the headlights and keep going until you see buildings again. Buildings? I came out of a trance in which I'd forgotten there was anybody but ourselves left alive. Don't tell me somebody's being crazy enough to build a town up here. Dave clambered back into the Land Rover. A town's a bit of a flattering name for King Gunya. Almost on the last word, as I let in the clutch, he closed his eyes and grunted. I was on my own. That's the end of Chapter 1. Next week we'll start Chapter 2, Dust Track to the Ellis. All right, well, I hope you're enjoying this, and hope you didn't turn off when you heard biography. Anyway, that's our new storybook, Land Rovers, and we'll carry on with Chapter 2 next week. Okay, and now it's time for, you guessed it, the Groaner. Well, in a small outback town, well, not necessarily in Australia, but a outback town in Canada, there was a gentleman who was well known for always catching his limit of fish. Didn't matter if nobody else got a bite. When he came home from fishing, he always had his limit. Well, finally, the conservation officer, game warden, fish and wildlife officer, you fill in the tag wherever you're from, whatever they call them there. Here they're conservation officers. Asked to go with him. The fellow didn't complain at all. Conservation officer climbed in the fellow's truck with him, and off they went. Got in the boat. The fellow rowed out to the middle of the lake, dropped an anchor, reached into a brown paper bag, pulled out a stick of dynamite, lit the fuse, and threw it in the water. Well, there was an almighty explosion, and a bunch of fish floated to the surface. And the man started picking them up and tossing them in the boat. Well, the conservation officer was just aghast. And finally, when he kind of came out of his stunned silence, he looks at the old man and says, "You can't do that. That's illegal." And the old man reaches into the brown paper bag, pulls out a stick of dynamite, lights the fuse, throws it in the conservation officer's lap and says, "Are you going to talk or are you going to fish?" Well, there you go. Hope you've enjoyed today's story and the Groaner, and well, you may not have enjoyed the Groaner, but anyway, hope you have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.